Hello, and welcome to our weekly LinkedIn Live leadership series, Voices of Leadership. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kathy Eastwood, your host and the founder and CEO of E equals Y. Each week, we explore the fascinating world of leadership featuring voices from various generations, industries, and backgrounds. A team's job is to deliver results. It's the role of the leader to empower, inspire, and enable the people and the team to deliver those results. And there's a repeatable formula to drive that success, the E3 leadership code: express plus engage plus execute, powered by emotion. However, each leader's approach to applying that leadership code is unique because there's no one way to lead. And our live sessions really aim to showcase these diverse voices of leadership. And as we meet them, we're going to learn what drives them, what's their unique leadership style, etc. So please feel free to introduce yourself, use this as an opportunity to network. Let us know where you're calling in from. But most importantly, please ask questions, because when you ask questions, then we're able to, really tailor this for you. So let me get started and introduce our guest today. I've been really looking forward to this conversation because we're not just getting into what culture change really looks like inside in organizations, because change is not a one-time program. Right? It's part of how leaders show up every day. So, our guest today is Franck Appleby, who brings a truly global perspective to his work. He's originally from Denmark, based now in Switzerland, but today is back in Copenhagen. So
Yeah.
a little bit of a full circle. And he's led leadership, talent, and transformation work across industries, regions, and business models, and most recently at Novartis. He's helping organizations navigate both growth and complexity at scale. And what I appreciate most, and what I know we're going to impact today, is how grounded Frank's approach is. Culture change doesn't happen from one big event or announcement. It's about what he calls micro ambition, those small daily choices leaders make that compound over time. And we'll also get into some of the leadership challenges that show up along the way, things like fear, ego, uncertainty, and doubt, or as I like to say, managing the feud, which every leader faces when driving change. So, Frank, senior HR leader in the space, thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining us today. This was my quick intro. Why don't you share with the audience a little bit more about yourself, your leadership style, how you got to where you are?
No worries. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation, Kathy, and hello everyone. I am Frank, and I always have one joke I share, which is I will be frank with you, and so I'll promise I'll do that the next sort of half an hour or so. Yes, I am originally from Denmark in Copenhagen, where I'm coming to you from today, and I have spent a lot of time outside of Denmark in various locations such as Australia, India, New Zealand, Switzerland, and so forth. And I think what I always love about being in new places is that you kind of learn new things about the people that you obviously are working with, the culture that you're part of in terms of the national culture. But you also look at some elements that are almost like universal, right? And I think that for me, there are some learnings that I certainly will try and share today that I think maybe could be helpful for others. And they center around leadership, particularly, but also around culture, because the two are heavily interlinked. And if I go back to your three E's in terms of express, engage, and execute, I think you add all that together. I think you get the fourth E, which is excellence. So
I like that.
hopefully I can contribute to that today.
Great. So tell us about your journey. So you've talked about being all around.
Yeah.
How did you get into HR, and how did you end up driving culture change and really elevating, teams and leadership and talent?
Yeah. Look, I think from my perspective, it was always I always had a passion and desire for people, and when I started my career many years ago, 25 plus years ago, it was still a little bit old school. It was not quite personnel or HR, but it was very much focused more on process and record keeping, and I certainly was lucky enough to meet a few people who were mentors to me. who really want to sort of try and take HR into a space where it was really about moving the dial around how do we actually create an experience where people are actually adding to the bottom line of the company, and at the same time also have a fulfilling experience while they're there.
Mhm.
So it was kind of partly by design, but also partly by I guess choosing to really connect with people that actually I could learn from.
I love it. And, it's interesting. When I got into HR as well, I come from a very different background. Like I started from as a CPA, which is a chartered accountant, in Europe. And, driving change was what I had really done. But what I learned is if you want to drive change, you have to focus on the people, right? And
Yes.
bring them along on the journey.
Yeah. No, absolutely, 100%. And I think is what is the good thing is I think there's so much time now is now spent really on thinking about how do we shape a people agenda, certainly in the space that I'm in, where that is really running in support and in parallel with the business in terms of making sure that it actually helps to amplify, the business agenda. So rather than just seeing as a cost center, which is kind of what it used to be, right? It's
Right.
something, and so I like to think it's an investment, not a cost center, right? So let's make more investment and the right investment so we can propel our people and the business at the same time.
I agree, and I've also often coached a lot of CEOs to make sure there's 2 people that I think should be at the executive table, is the people need to be represented, right? So, who's running the people agenda and the customer, right?
Yeah,
Those are the 2 people that's why we're in business, right? We serve the customer by the people, and
yeah,
that's so critical for how we drive things forward. So, you talk about culture, help us unpack what does
yeah.
culture mean to you? Because I think sometimes different people have different points of view around what is culture.
Yeah, I think culture is like one of those words, a bit like communication. It means everything and nothing. So for me, it's important when I sort of think about culture in terms of how do we actually give it a level of concreteness so we can actually do something with it. And I like to think of culture in terms of what are the expectations and what are the prevailing beliefs that we would like to have permeating through our business. So how do we want people to think and how do we want people to show up in the way that they behave? And that sounds very easy to say, but very hard to do and implement. But culture is very much around that in terms of expectations around behaviors, in terms of an expectation around obviously how we create some shared beliefs of how we work together and how we deliver results, and that requires, in my experience, a level of orchestration in terms of getting people from different parts of the business, stakeholders, if you like, to really sort of try to come together and actually have some conversation. And in support of that, also making sure that some of the systems and the processes that we have in place are also being adjusted to support the desired way that we want to show up and work together. So, for instance, if we want to say we want to be have a culture where we are focusing on, let's say, the customer, so let's make sure that the systems and the processes that we put in place are also customer friendly from an internal customer perspective as well as an external customer.
I love it. There's so much there to unpack. So, what I just quick, you're not saying that culture is a set of values that go up on the wall and are
No, yeah.
reviewed when you start at a company.
No, that's right. I mean, and the classic example of that is the company where that had values on the wall when you walk into the foyer. Like, for instance, I think they had integrity, communication, and so on. And when you actually ask which company are we talking about here, it was actually the company that I think they were called, what are they called? Exron, the company that
Oh,
went bust.
Enron, yeah.
Enron, yeah.
Right.
So there were a beautiful illustration of the disconnect between having beautiful values on the wall, but the actual lived culture on a day-to-day basis was completely disconnected. So it doesn't mean you shouldn't have values on the wall. What I'm saying is that it's the operating culture, the day-to-day culture, that is really the real indicator of, how people they think and how they show up on a day-to-day basis. That is your culture, not necessarily what is your aspirational culture, which is kind of what's on the wall.
Yeah, I love that because you could have this is what we want to be, but it can be very different on how it's shown up and
That's
how
right.
it's seen in the business. So what I love that you shared, right, is about expectations.
Yeah,
And to me, when we talk about the E3 leadership code, that's first and foremost is
yeah,
express what is the purpose? What are we
yeah,
doing? Why are we doing it?
yeah,
What are the behaviors that we want? And then I heard you saying, really get it, engage the people,
yeah.
right? So getting their buy-in. And then I heard the execution of you have to operationalize this.
Yes, correct.
So talk to me a little bit about how do you go about setting those expectations as a company? Is it something that you've seen works well as a top down, or is this really where you bring everyone together to help build that?
I remember a mentor of mine many years ago told me that, remember this, Frank, whatever interest your boss needs to fascinate you. And what he meant by that is that but you cannot take away is that sometimes when you look at an organization, and you always have a hierarchy, even though we are flattening the hierarchy these days, you normally have a leader that someone is reporting to, and ultimately will be the CEO, and that will always be there. So I think one dynamic to be very much aware of is that the importance of leaders, because they will always have disproportionate impact on the expectations of the organization. But that's in itself, of course, is not enough. You also need to obviously engage people, not just leaders, in a conversation around, what are these expectations, and try to articulate it, but also demonstrate it through your actions, both as a leader, but also as an individual contributor or an employee more broadly, that how it comes to life on a day-to-day basis. But leaders particularly, they hold the key, because what people, they always do is they look up before they look
Mm.
in. So they always look up in terms of what is my leader doing, not doing, before they look at themselves. And they, if they see that, okay, I can see on the wall it says integrity, but my leader is doing something that is completely a disconnect between what they say and what they do, then that integrity is not really something we care about in reality, right? So
Yep.
ensuring that we get leaders on board is really a disproportionate importance to actually get cultural change to happen in the organization while you're engaging the wider group of people.
I love that. And it reminds me of a video I had done recently, but we look, I always equate it to flying on an airplane. When you
Yeah.
have that turbulence,
Yep.
who's the first person you look at? I look at the flight attendant, right?
Yeah.
If they're not worried, then I'm like, okay, we're good.
Yeah.
But they are going to model the behavior we
Yeah.
need, right? And I
Yeah.
think that's what shows up in
Yeah.
companies and organizations as well.
Yeah. That exactly. And I think ultimately my experience as well. I think when we talk about leaders, of course, it doesn't mean that. I mean, I think it leaders at all levels, of course, but it goes without saying that, of course, senior leaders carry a disproportionate role, particularly as a symbol for the organization as well,
Mm.
depending on the scale of the organization. But of course, middle managers and frontline leaders as well, because culture is typically shaped on a day-to-day basis, in the team that I'm part of, because that's
Mhm.
where I have the proximity of relationships, and that's where I have the people that are really, that's where the rubber hits the road, right? And that's why it's so important that you think about culture not in just in big terms, in terms of like long aspirational terms, but also think about on a day-to-day basis in the flow of work. How does this culture come to life in the way that we operate and the way we behave and treat one another?
Yeah, I really like that. And so, Frank, as you talk about that, I've heard a lot of people share with me, like, well, why do I bother? The senior leadership isn't,
Yeah,
you know, uh, following this, they're not on board. But
yeah,
if I'm a middle manager and a first line manager, do you believe that people can still make a huge impact and start to build that culture themselves?
yeah. I mean, I like to say that it's not culture to you; it's culture through you. And and
Mm,
and, and what that means is really that, irrespective of to what extent that your leader or the leaders above you are doing certain things or not, I mean, you have the opportunity to create that experience on a day-to-day basis, not because of them, but despite of them. And so if you want to create an environment that is conducive to learning, performance, and enjoyment, you can still do that. And that has a positive impact, not just on you, but also, of course, on the team that you typically would manage. So there's, and often we think that we can't do anything because someone above me or someone over there, they're not doing it. Therefore, it's almost like my card to do nothing. But this is where this micro ambition comes in, because if you can, rather than think about the macro, think of the micro, think of actually what you can do to create that culture through you, rather than waiting for it. So be the change that you want to see, rather than wait for the change to be, because it's probably never going to happen.
Yeah. So what do you think stops people, though, from doing that? What have you seen that are some real blockers in organizations of being able to drive this kind of change in this culture that they want?
I think one of them is fear. You mentioned the feud framework earlier, and I think fear is a big blocker, and I think it's a natural thing. It's not something we should shy away from and think that we can all just sort of put fear aside. And it's more around how to try to understand what I'm fearful of, and why that fear is there, and actually how I can step into that fear and actually understand it a little bit better, and then try to use that as a springboard for actually trying to take some action and see, what happens. Take a bit of risk, and it doesn't have to be a big risk. It's micro risk, right? So try and do something. I mean, if your leader or your leader's leaders are not doing something that you think they're doing something wrong, try to do something right for your own team and actually see what that does, right? So I think sometimes we think that we are less powerful than what we are because fear sometimes overwhelms us.
Yeah, I've seen that quite a bit, and I mean that fear can paralyze people, but it also shows up, which I find interesting. I'd love your point of view on this. Is people will say, well, they don't care, or they have bad intentions, or
Yeah.
they're trying to make this difficult. But do you find that a lot of times the bad intention that's viewed is actually their other people's fear, and so they're trying to protect
Yeah.
themselves as well?
It is funny, right? Because whenever we use when we judge others, it's often around they either have a bad intent. When we judge ourselves, we always have a noble intent, right? So there's a bit of a disconnect sometimes. And I think, we like to kind of catastrophize sometimes around other people's intention. And I'm sure no one has when they get out of bed in the morning, they think, I mean, I'm going to be a really bad leader today. I don't think anyone sets out with that intention when they get out of bed, even bad leaders. So I think it's more trying to understand, first of all, where are these people coming from in terms of, and even because I can read into their intent, but trying to understand where they're coming from, I think is always a good question. And then at the same time, focus more on what you can do to come from a noble intent and actually trying to make a positive impact and difference. But don't get caught up in what you think other people's deceitful intent or whatever it may be, because sometimes it's actually our own biases that we're projecting.
Absolutely, I agree with that, and I've seen it over and over again, and that's what we have a saying that no one wakes up with bad intent, right? And so as we're going through the book, to keep that on the top of mind, my father used to say it: never judge until you've walked a mile in someone else's
Yeah,
shoes. Right, and that's how
yeah,
I think about it, is when
yeah,
it changes the whole momentum of something when you sit back and go, "Oh, wait a minute, maybe I'm not the only one, and maybe,
yeah,
they have a noble cause too, and let's
yeah,
understand and how do we work together." So you use the word micro steps, micro ambition.
yeah.
Talk a little bit more about this, because I know this is something you're really passionate about, and I'd love to hear. I don't want to try to butcher it. I'd love to hear it in your words.
Yeah, look, I think when I first started my experience work around leadership and culture, I always focused it a lot on the collective, because when we think of culture, we think about the us, we think about the we. But what I learned along the way is that it is important, of course, to cultivate a we, a collective sort of desire, a collective ambition, a collective way of thinking and operating and so on. But what is also important is the me with the we. And the me is really where culture, it goes back to what I said earlier, that, it's culture through me. And that is, how do I actually sort of set an ambition, not just for what the organization needs to do, but also for how I show up. And rather than make it like a long-term and very ambitious thing, focus on what you can control the most. And what you typically can control the most is how you show up in the moment, or at least show up in the short term, because that's where you have the highest visibility, and that's where you can make the biggest impact. So micro ambitions is really about actually thinking about how you can seize every moment, and how you can show up with a fully present, and fully dedication to what's in front of you, rather than waiting for things to happen or waiting for other people to come and rescue you, if you like. So it really puts you into the driver's seat, and that's where, so forget about macro ambition, focus more on the micro ambition in terms of what you can do and what you can focus on, and that's kind of where, that's why I sort of love that phrase of micro ambition.
Yeah, I like that. And, one of the things we talk about a lot in Equals Y is knowing yourself,
Yeah,
right? And really knowing your values, your
yeah,
goals,
yeah,
because then to your point, you're really being the change agent. And when
yeah,
you can understand who you are, what your behaviors are,
yeah,
then you can connect with others, right? That's how you start to build up into the we.
yeah.
But first, it starts with me.
Me, exactly. Yeah,
But what I like and what I think I'm hearing you say, because sometimes we get nervous of there's no I in team. You've
yeah,
heard that
yeah.
phrase,
That's right.
right? I don't, what you're talking about is very different from that. It's really about bringing your whole self to
Yeah.
make sure you put the team first.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Exactly.
So,
Yeah.
have you ever had a situation where people are like, well, yeah, so it's all about me? Because if people can interpret things the wrong way sometimes.
Look, everything, of course, can be taken to an extreme or into a context that is helpful or unhelpful, if you like. But I think when one of the aspects around this piece around micro ambitions is actually it's around the piece around self-awareness, right? Because that you were just talking about, and because if I go in fully fledged that I am perfect, I can do everything, it's almost like that kind of superhero kind of thinking, then that's not really what I mean. What it is more about is it's to say that, I mean, in terms of responsibility, the ability to respond to a challenge or an opportunity, that is me, right? And I can obviously leverage the people around me because I'm not necessarily perfect, but it starts with this kind of commitment and desire to actually want to make the difference and be the change to make a difference. Now, one of the key starting point in cultural change as well has been anchor around self-awareness,
Mm,
and that means, and we all have blind spots. I mean, I don't think anyone is perfect, but if we assume that we have that as leaders and we have that as individuals within the organization, then this self-awareness journey is an important part of unlocking the I or the me, if you like, in the we, because that's really where we start to say, okay, how can I maybe also learn about how I'm impacting people around me and how I'm impacting the organization more broadly. So I'm starting to hold up the mirror to say, okay,
mm,
there's a lot of good stuff that I'm probably doing, but there may also be some things that are not helpful for me and not helpful for our culture in the organization. So this sort of self-awareness piece is an important piece of the journey, and that also means that if you have people who think, oh yeah, I'm the me and the we here, that's really not, that's arrogance. That's not
mm.
humility, right? And so I'm not talking about arrogance. I'm talking about humility with ability. So humility to be able to continue to ask the question, sorry, how am I impacting the organization? How can I show up even better? How can I help people around? I mean, going out and actually being curious. I like to say, get curious, not furious. So be curious about how you can learn about yourself, and in order to improve yourself, but also the people around you and the culture more broadly. And that, particularly with leaders, is really, really key, because typically you will find that leaders, particularly the more senior you get, they may have sort of been very set and been successful in a certain way of showing up, and that may or may not serve the organization moving forward. So this whole self-discovery work around how I can continue to improve myself is such a vital thing for cultural change, and for anyone, not just for leaders. So that's probably one thing I would say.
Yeah, and you and I are, completely in agreement with that, because so much of what we try to do is help on that self-reflection first
Yeah,
and foremost. So we have a program where we in the boot camp is about understanding yourself and your leadership style. So we call it the
yeah,
E3 leadership profile. But
yeah,
one of the things I love doing then we'll do an assessment of your behaviors and how you show up, but it's the perception part
yeah,
that typically gets the eye-opening ahas, because people are like, oh yeah, I'm loyal, or I'm really good at getting to the end point fast, but they suddenly learn, oh wait a minute, that doesn't land with everyone, that can be interpreted differently, and I'm
yeah.
turning people off. And the more you know about yourself, the more you can then interact with others and help influencing them.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So I think it's kind of almost like an ongoing project to continue to try and think about how can I improve myself on a day-to-day basis, rather than say I'm perfect as I am. And it goes back to I learned a lot from Tim Galway, who was the grandfather of coaching many years ago, and he sort of said to me there was kind of three things you try to optimize, right? One is, of course, performance, which is how do we deliver performance for the organization, and that's why typically we're in the job, right? And that's why we measure and so on. But it's not enough in itself. The other thing you also think about is how can you find enjoyment in what you do in order to deliver performance. But that's not enough. It's also about how can you learn so you can continue to grow as an individual and as a leader, and to innovate so you can deliver performance for the organization. So obviously, enjoyment and learning by itself is not without performance. It's not enough. But I think getting those sort of three variables to connect up is really what it's all about. And the other thing that I remember Tim always said to me was like that performance is basically potential minus interference. And what he meant by that is that we have a potential to deliver certain performance, but sometimes we get in our own way. And what gets in our own way is the way that maybe we think, or the way that we behave. And that's why this piece around self-awareness and self-discovery is so important, because then we understand ourselves better in terms of how we show up and how we can do that more effectively, and how we can impact people around us and the organization more broadly in a more intentional and impactful way.
Excellent. Absolutely true. And Frank, what I'm also hearing is when you explain it that way, you're going down even into the individual contributors.
Yep.
What you're
100%.
talking about is every single
Yep.
person within an
Yep.
organization
Yep.
is a leader and
Correct.
has the ability and
Correct.
has a huge impact on
Yes.
driving cultural
Yes.
change and
Yes.
driving business.
Yes. Because people leadership is by role, personal leadership is for everyone, and you need both. You
Hmm.
need people leaders to really, to lead to lead it in the right way, but you also need everyone to show up as a leader from a personal leadership perspective. And when the two comes together, that's when you start to get traction on your cultural journey.
Yep. Frank, I could talk to you all day because the nuggets are coming at us, right? Like having culture come through us. You talked about being curious, not furious. That self-reflection, not being arrogant, but being humble and having humility show up and being a personal leader in everything you do. Why don't you bring us home? Let's wrap this up, because believe it or not, it's at the end of the half hour,
Yeah,
and I know it's happy
yeah,
hour for you
yeah,
and you need to get
yeah, yeah,
going.
yeah.
Um, What advice would you have for leaders that are looking to really make a difference and grow their careers and grow organizations?
Look, I would say, first of all, don't be a passenger. Take the driver's seat. If it's meant to be, it's up to me. And I think what I've seen, if you can be proactive in terms of trying to go on the front foot, even when it's difficult, you're more likely to be successful. And that applies to career. And I see that when I work with people as well. People who are, for instance, are really not happy with the organization. There's always something that is not right. It's often they're waiting for things to happen. And so I would say my biggest advice is, try to go on the front foot and live by that mantra, like, if it's meant to be, it's up to me. And then, of course, leverage people around you, because what I've also learned is that people are actually much more likely and willing to help if you ask for help. And but sometimes we don't do that, and so we're caught in this double bound of I'm waiting and waiting and waiting, and I'm not asking for help. And so that would kind of be my advice.
I love it. Excellent. You have so many great nuggets. Thank you so much for joining us today. I really enjoyed our conversation. And I look forward to maybe having you back even because you have so much to share. And it is important that we all have to be leaders and we all need to be authentic. We need to have self reflection. And it isn't a one and done type exercise, right? We're continuously investing in ourselves.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for having me, Kathy. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Frank. And thanks so much for everyone that's joined us. Please take a look at our website at e=y.com. Some of the stuff that Frank talked about, we have a boot camp that allows you to do that self reflection, learn how to work better with teams, and really how to be more curious and more proactive and really start with that, putting that foot forward and moving ahead. Thanks all, and have a great weekend.